Well, Gerald or Jerry, excuse me, Jerry. thanks for joining me on this episode of Fun and Victorious. It's great to connect with you and your writing and all the fun stuff you've been doing. That I've been following at least a little bit more recently, and I just want to get to know you and just dive into what you've been doing. So, if you don't mind, Jerry, would you mind taking a moment just to introduce yourself, say who you are, what you do for a living, and then we'll just take it from there.
Cool. Yeah. Jerry Brennan, USMA class of 99, A2 and then B3. And then I went to, I was medically boarded out of the Army at graduation. Basically, I had an issue come up first year. And then I ended up going to journalism school. Within a couple years, I went to Columbia. So, New York was always the fun place as a cadet. So I figured, why not move to the fun place?
Right.
Yeah. So I was kind of trying to find my feet for a few years. I think a lot of us, coming out of a rigidly structured environment where everything's kind of planned out years and ahead. It takes a while to get used to not having that structure. After grad school, I ended up back in Chicago, working for some other old grads at a telecom company. Was actually working in the Sears Tower on 9/11, which was interesting. So this whole forever war thing, though I didn't serve, it's really kind of coincided with my adult life, basically, in a way. Was tossing around a lot of notions about what to do with myself and just how to feel worthwhile. I always kind of knew I was a writer. I worked on a big semi-autobiographical project under a pen name for a few years, and then the project I was avoiding, though, was and we didn't get a chance to talk about it. Is your name Czech or
no? It's Lithuanian.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. This project is I know the letters and whatnot are
super ethnic.
So I was working on a Czech-related project about the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, and I was just obsessed with this. I actually wrote it as screenplays first, and I went out to Hollywood in 2006 for this pitch fest. And the thing you realize, even kind of dipping your toe in, is screenwriting is such a collaborative process. Movie making is so collaborative, and
right.
So many gears have to mesh in terms of money and people kind of coming together at the same time.
Right.
And so I was at least with writing, there's not as many people involved, and at least I have some control over the output. So I'll go back to Chicago and work on this project and write it as a novel. And if worse comes to worst, I'll figure a way to get it out myself. And spent 3 years of major writing and research after having done a lot of research before I started. And then another 3 years, kind of polishing it and shopping it. And the only times I got traction were, there was one agency where a friend of a friend had recently worked there, and I got an in, and I didn't have to send a blind query, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is in amazing shape. We never get manuscripts that are this good. And they had me do a round of revisions and then totally ghosted me. To this date, I have no idea what happened. And then another agency, a journalism school classmate, had gotten published there, or through there, had an agent there. And, I sent stuff to his agent, and, they asked for the full manuscript, and, just totally ghosted again. And So in 2012, basically, I know
Yeah.
this is like a long story.
No, that's fine. No, you're good. Keep going.
Yeah. So my at the time live-in girlfriend got pregnant. We were expecting our first child and deciding to get married and
Right.
raise our daughter and all that stuff. And I knew like life was going to kind of look different pretty soon, and I was like,
Yeah.
I've got a little bit of time to like get this out there. And
Right.
because there's two kinds of authors. Basically, it's kind of a spectrum, but there's people who sit on stuff for too long, and there's people who get stuff out there too quick and too readily without like checking it out. And there's dangers in both approaches, but I definitely lean towards the sit on stuff too long end of the spectrum. And I just kind of needed to get this project like off my desk and move on to the next thing. And I also just had this vision of a brand like Tortoise Books. Like I always loved the tortoise and the hare, like this notion of like slow and steady wins in the end.
Right.
I'm a very like slow, deliberate person by temperament, and so like as a cadet, I got a fair amount of hazing from that. And,
Yeah.
like I remember watching Goodfellas like as a plebe, and there's that line that like Paulie might have moved slow, but it was only because Paulie didn't have to move for nobody. And I was
right.
like, that's what I want. I want to be Paulie. Like I want to be this guy who can move at a slow, deliberate pace, and nobody gets to tell me like hurry up. And also too, like I've heard in the business world that there's a trinity of things that you can have, well, there's three things, like fast, good, and cheap, and you can only have two of those three at any one time. And so given the financial constraints of starting stuff without a lot of money, we've kind of opted for good and cheap,
Right.
and the slow, deliberate approach. And so I had also been like working on editing a little literary newspaper here in Chicago, and I kind of liked editing and whatnot. And I was like, I should open this company up for submissions and just have it, because there was that thought like, well, it could be like the Nine Inch Nails, this is just me kind of thing.
Right.
Or I could like open it up. And it took a long while to get my first submission that I really wanted to work with. But that little inspiration voice was like, say yes to this one, like read this one. And that author, he had gotten a little farther than me. Like he had an agent, but he and his agent were butting heads over, because he had written a book with a 15-year-old protagonist, and his agent was like, this is young adult, you need to take out like the masturbation and whatnot.
Oh geez.
And he's like, no, so anyway, they were butting heads about how to edit this project, and it just wasn't finding its way out there. And so they kind of parted ways, and he submitted to me, and this manuscript was in great shape. And it was one of those things where it's like, if you polish this thing anymore, it's going to fall apart,
Right.
And we did do a couple tweaks to it in the editing process, but like really not a lot. And that guy, Gianno Cromley, he's one of my best friends now. I mean, it was a very fortuitous random pairing with a local author who ended up just being the perfect person to work on a project with, and one of my best friends to boot now. And then our second outside author, he had already been published on St. Martin's. Like he had, he'd gotten further than Gianna. He had gotten like the New York Big Five book deal or whatever, and the big attention and whatnot. And, that's, one of the things I learned in my very limited time in Hollywood is like the way people get fired in the entertainment industry is by saying yes to things they should have said no to.
Right.
Because the guy told me like anybody can say no to Harry Potter like accidentally, and then oh, it blows up like from somebody else, and who would have thought? But if you say yes to something and spend a lot of money on it, and it doesn't go anywhere, like sooner or later you're going to be out of a job. So
Right. Yep.
So basically, like the tendency is for the industry to get kind of small c conservative, like anyone in the entertainment industry. Like, okay, this worked in the past. We can guarantee like that this is going to sell like X many copies. So we can guarantee that if we spend this amount of money on it, it's going to work. And the problem is nobody really knows until it's out there, like what's going to sell or not. You know, like you can make all these guesswork estimates and whatnot, and nobody knows for sure. You know, so like, you know, so we've had the freedom to kind of take a chance on things that other people wouldn't necessarily take a chance on. And granted, like we have a little bit less, we've traded freedom for structure a little bit because we have a distributor now. Because you realize like there is, you know, the flip side of that is there's only so much you can do on your own. Like there's only so many like independent bookstores I can have a relationship with and get them to stock the book. And then like, yeah, like, you know, it's a lot of work, like having one-on-one relationships with bookstores, convincing them to stock a book. And then like, you know, if somebody's like bulky with payments, it's like, how much time do you spend like trying to collect, you know, a $200-300 invoice that may mean a lot for a particular project, but with everything else you have to do, you know. So we've traded freedom for structure a little bit because we have a distributor now, Publishers Group West, and they're part of the Ingram family, which is a really big book distributor content group. And
interesting.
Yeah, and so now we're just building out that relationship and just trying to find that right balance of freedom and structure, you know.
Interesting. It's so I can kind of relate with some of the things, a lot of the things you've been talking about so far. So I'm not sure how much you know about me, but when I got out of the Army back in like 2013, I was actually trying to pursue a creative career in the film industry specifically. So I had a brief stint, you know, working at Walt Disney Studios as an intern for about 6 months, which was pretty cool. But what's interesting is just some of the talking points you just brought up about reaching out to stores and trying to sell like a book. Like that's something I've been going through recently with, not with a book, but with my game Crypto Cartel. And so like what I'm just, the past 2 months have been really exciting for me as, you know, as a new small business owner, entrepreneur, where I just been reaching out to stores to try to, you know, stock my game, kind of like what you're talking about with these, you know, independent bookstores, where it requires a lot of work and effort to call them and get them to commit and move forward. And so that's been a very interesting learning experience that has taught me a lot of really big lessons. I want to ask you a quick question about something you mentioned as you're talking about your pitches and such, especially with Hollywood. What was the pitch fest that you went out to, and what was the project again?
The pitch fest, basically it was like speed dating with agencies and production companies, except like you do all the talking and they do all the rejecting, basically. So they would arrange these like sit down minutes where you just have a couple minutes to tell them like, hey, this is the project I've got a screenplay for. And you know, it's, you know, and you realize like there's certain things that like on your own you never think about, and then within the industry everybody's like duh, because it's like a, you know, blindingly obvious to like everybody in there. Like for instance, you know, trying to sell a big historical epic screenplay, like that's a huge, you know, a screenplay is different from any other art form in that it's got to be a work of art itself, but it's also kind of a business plan.
It is,
you know, it's something that somebody has to look at and say, okay, you know, this scene is going to cost like $2 million to film. You know, this scene is going to cost like $30,000, and they have to be able to figure that stuff out. and you realize like pitching a screenplay, you're like, okay, this thing that I thought was going to be like a no-brainer, like big hit, is actually a huge potential commitment of like time and energy and resources.
Yep.
Whereas other things like, you know, romantic comedy, like contemporary romantic comedies, where like you don't have the period detail and the set level and stuff, like, you know, maybe that doesn't interest me as an author personally to write, but as a studio that's trying to, you know, maximize reward and minimize risk, that's a much more attractive project potentially.
Yeah.
So just a lot of stuff like that, like you just like never think about when you're on the outside, and then you realize like, oh, everybody knows this here.
Absolutely. That reminds me of, there's a book that I read when I was deployed to Iraq, because I was kind of I was pretty focused on having a creative career after my time in the military as an officer. There's a book that I read. It was called, not sure if you've heard of this, How to Write Movies for Film and Profit. I'm sorry, for Fun and Profit. It's by Thomas Lennon and Robert Ben Garant, the two main writers from Reno 911. And what's really interesting and it plays into a lot of like what you're talking about, where they say they want, like one of the biggest takeaways I got from that book is if you can write with like specific actors in mind, where as you're constructing this screenplay, if you say, okay, my protagonist looks like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, you can even go as far as say that, where it's you're trying to, you know, show the business proposition with what you're writing, and so that way they can connect it. They can say, oh yeah, I can see you know, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson with Jesse Eisenberg in this, you know, comedic military movie or whatever it is that you're writing, which is really interesting because there's definitely a lot of different elements that go into putting together a screenplay, because like you said, there's obviously a huge risk with a lot of these films, and it reminds me of like you talk about how these, you know, if you make a big movie, right, you spend all this money and it flops. One of the things I learned about more recently was, do you remember the movie, the film Hook in the mid-90s? Yeah. So that movie went through a couple different iterations. They were first trying to make it a musical. There were rumors that Michael Jackson was going to be Peter Pan. But they eventually landed on Robin Williams, and Steven Spielberg was kind of like going back and forth as to like whether or not he should or shouldn't be a part of the, you know, there's like a little bit of conflict going on. But anyways, they had a blank check for that film for like the set design, which is why the sets look absolutely amazing. Like that's why there's snow, there's all these like this random wildlife that's in there. And but to that point though, the film didn't do as well as they wanted it to do. And then they're like, probably not going to give out blank checks anymore. Fast forward a few years later, there's Battlefield Earth, which completely bombed as well. Sometimes Hollywood doesn't remember their lessons, but that's for sure the case. I wanted to ask you a question about, you know, so you went from West Point into like journalism. So maybe you can explain this. So how did you make that connection between being, you know, your time as a cadet at West Point and then wanting to venture into writing? Like, how did you land on journalism from West Point to Columbia?
Well, I'd been a history major at the academy, and that was, cool. And it's like the English department just rubbed me the wrong way, like plebe English. To me, it was like this absurd caricature of what a military English instruction would be like, just so much rote memorization and, you know, very rigid, like analysis of lines and poems and stuff. And it just beat all the fun out of it. Whereas the history department was just, like the history department to me was just so much more fun and freewheeling and, you know, encouraging of independent thought. And I was always kind of a news junkie too, because, you know, I always heard like, you know, newspapers are the first rough draft of history.
Interesting.
So then after graduation, I hadn't really, like, they were literally waffling about whether or not to commission me until Sunday of grad week. And at the end of the day, like it was 99, it was pre-war on terror. They had more people than I knew what to do with. I had a medical condition like narcolepsy requires, regular medication. They were like, we'll just give him his diploma and let him go. So I really had not made any other plans, because up until a week before, I was like, well, maybe I'm going to a basic course in a couple of months. I don't know,
Yeah.
And then, so yeah, I was really just structureless. I was back like living at home with my parents in suburban Chicago, just feeling like a total loser. And
Yeah.
I went to see The Insider, like the movie with Al Pacino and Russell Crowe.
Right.
And at the end of the movie, Russell Crowe, Al Pacino is playing Lowell Bergman, and the Mike Wallace character says to him like about something. He says like, "So does this interest you?" Just asking about some story idea, and he says like, "Everything interests me." And I was like, "That's me." And then in the end credits, like they're like, "Oh, Lowell Bergman is currently a professor of journalism at the UC Berkeley Journalism School." And so I'm like, instantly, like I have a mission. Like I always think of that opening scene of like Apocalypse Now, where like Martin Sheen's like all drunk in his hotel room. And he's like, "I have a mission," and like instantly it's like, all right, I've got a mission, and it's to go to journalism school. And so I applied to Columbia, Northwestern, and Berkeley. I may have missed the deadline for getting all my stuff in, because it was like it was like when I looked at the calendars, it was like, all right, this needs to happen now. But I got into Northwestern and Columbia, but I wanted out of Chicago. I wanted back to New York. So went to Columbia.
So like, that's interesting, because I too was also a history major at the academy. I was a military history major, so it's kind of funny hearing that as well. Yeah, a lot of common themes in this conversation. But no, what's really funny hearing, or what something that I find really interesting is the fact that I'm sure that there's a lot of carryover with what you've done with journalism and what you've learned while studying journalism at Columbia. So what kind of carryovers did you take from, actually, even being from a history major to journalism to the creative space? Like what are some things that you've kind of picked up along the way?
Basically figuring out where information comes from, and who's telling you a story and why, which is like a level of critical thinking that I hate to say, but a lot of Americans have lost these days. Like they'd rather just trust some meme, not to get too political, but they'd rather just trust some meme that they read on Facebook when they're on the toilet, rather than digging into who's an authoritative source. One of my formative experiences in journalism school was, they give you beats in like different neighborhoods of the city, and I was down in Crown Heights in Brooklyn looking for a story, and I was trying to talk to kids about like education and like the internet was fairly new at this time, and like I was asking some kid, I was like, "So do you go on websites for schoolwork?" And he was like, "Oh yeah. And I'm like, "What do you go on?" He's like, "Oh, like plantsandanimals.com." He's just telling me something like that. And when I'm back at my computer, I like look it up, and of course it doesn't exist. And it occurs to me like, oh, this kid is skipping school. It's the middle of the day. Some grown-up is asking him questions, and he just wants to get rid of me. So he's just making up something, So yeah, you really realize like everybody has an agenda in talking, and like, what's their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? Can you trust them? And so you kind of learn to figure out who's an authoritative source. Who can I trust? With the space writing, I've done a lot of reporting with it. It's fiction and hopefully somewhat literary, but for the Infinite Blues, the book I think you got. I had a retired space shuttle flight director who had actually consulted on my previous book. Like I wrote the first two books mostly on my own and doing whatever research I could do off of the computer. And then I was bored at work one day because I, still had a day job because these things weren't paying the bills.
Of course, yeah.
Oh,
the creative life.
Yeah. I was bored at work and I started, I don't know if you've ever heard the term like ego surfing, where you like Google yourself or your project or whatever. I started like ego surfing at work, and I found this blog post on this blog called Rockets from Cassiopeia.
Interesting.
And this guy's like a flight director for the International Space Station, and he had somehow found and read and enjoyed the first two books. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And then I'm writing the third one, and it's about this like year-long trip to Venus. And I'm getting into it, and I start to realize like, okay, there's going to be a communications delay in the conversations because of the speed of light and whatnot, and like on the moon missions, for instance, it's only about a couple seconds. So like, you can hear a little pause in the transmissions, but you start writing scenes and you realize like, wait a second, like, is it going to take 10 seconds for people to respond? Is it going to take a minute? Like,
Right.
And so I wrote to this guy and I was like, I need to find out, like, just outrageous question. Like, I need to find out for a mission to Venus, like, what would the comms delay be for any given day of the mission? And he's like, and this guy, like, he's super cool, but he's like, he's busy helping fly the International Space Station and whatnot. And but he got me in touch with another NASA guy who is like a retired flight director who had a little more time on his hands, a guy named Dan Adamo, and he was gracious enough to work with me and figure out the whole trajectory for this Venus mission, to be like, okay, and gave me a whole spreadsheet, like, okay, on day 20 it's going to be this many minutes, on day 50 it's going to be this many minutes, and that was another thing I learned in journalism school, is like, you basically 10% of what you dig up is going to go up in a story, not because you're hiding anything, but because you're just trying to capture the essence of something, and you have a very limited amount of time to get people's attention, and you need to tell a story that people are going to remember. Right. And you can't just provide a running transcript of like what somebody says. You have to kind of look for what's new and noteworthy and whatnot. So you kind of learn, like, you do a lot of reporting and maybe 10% of it's going to end up in a story just because of space constraints and storytelling constraints. And so it's the same thing here. Like, you need to learn a lot so that you're confident in it, but not a lot of it's necessarily going to go in there. So
that reminds me of one of the lessons I learned about screenwriting, and that is the more white space you have on your page, the better it is. Because if you put way too much on there, you can lose people really quick. That kind of plays in what you're talking about. You want to just be to the point and just get people to move along and just kind of, like what you're saying, capture the essence of what the story is. That's interesting. And then question I wanted to ask you about the reaching out to people working who are professional people working in the space program. Like one of the things I've learned is that people tend to be very helpful when you want to reach out to them for even if it's for creative stuff. Were they generally pretty helpful in your experience, wanting to help you?
Yeah, definitely. You have to really, but there is the flip side of that, is there's a basic level of professionalism that you need to put forth. Like, you need to have kind of done your homework, because nobody's gonna, like nobody who's written a book about their life, for instance, is gonna just sit and answer questions that were already covered in the book, or just talking to Apollo astronauts, for instance, because I've met a lot of the Apollo astronauts now in the course of like research and writing and whatnot. A lot of these guys told their stories in great detail, like many, many, many times. So like, like I scored a phone interview with Edgar Mitchell, for instance, when I was working on Zero Phase. He was the sixth man to walk on the moon. But I didn't get anything from the phone interview that wasn't already covered in, the kind of definitive books about it and the definitive interviews and whatnot. So, the flip side of people wanting to be helpful is you need to show that you're asking for something that only they can give you. Mm-hmm. And only, and it's kind of important that, and that they're an expert on, and that, look, I've scoured the internet for this, and
right.
I've done what I can, but I need your help. So Infinite Blues, for instance, I was planning, you realize this spaceship, this scenario, you'd be in a polar orbit, overflying the poles. You realize, okay, they probably would have had a lot more time to talk with, somebody up in Greenland than with somebody down on the equator. So you start to think, okay, where would the ground stations be? What sequence would they talk to their ground stations?
Right.
And a lot of stuff like that. And again, it's not always going to go in, but you want to just write it and have the confidence of knowing that Stephen King had a great quote, because you can easily paralyze yourself too during doing research. You can, because one other thing that, and this was a big thing that I learned. I didn't learn in journalism school, but I learned later on. I've got a lot of fear that I'm not normally willing to cop to. And Stephen King has a great quote about writing where he says, most bad writing is driven by fear. Mm-hmm. So I think there can be that fear, okay, I've got to know all the details, and I've got to put all the details into something, or else people are going to think I don't know what I'm talking about,
Right.
And the flip side of that is faith in the small f sense that you're kind of confident that, okay, most people are going to get this. Most people are going to,
right,
understand that I've done my homework, and I may get some criticism from people who are reading it in bad faith or whatever, but mm-hmm. most people who are in good faith are going to read this and say okay, this person's done their homework. And so, you have to write from a point of faith and trust in your audience that, they're going to follow you along for the ride, and be willing to follow you as long as you show that you know what you're doing, basically.
Right. That's interesting, because I know a lot of people when they first start writing, were you pulling from Stephen King's On Writing? Is that where you're? Yeah. That's a pretty good book. So what I've kind of learned along the way too is that it's like going to the gym for the first time ever in your life. Yeah. You're gonna be horrifically out of shape is probably the best way to explain that. And then obviously after you start going for a while, you'll get more shape over time, of course. And it's the same thing with writing. All your bad writing, all your bad creative projects are going to come out in the beginning. And all this stuff is just going to eventually refine itself over time. And that's part of the reason why people kind of get hung up, I think, when they first start off writing or doing anything creative for that matter, where it's okay, this is really bad. Maybe I should stop. Maybe it's not for me. And it's maybe not, or maybe you can just keep going, keep doing those, keep doing the bench press, push-ups, whatever. And then you'll, who knows, maybe you actually get some good muscle mass going.
In that, I did want to add, Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird, is excellent writing book. And she's a big believer of shitty first drafts, she calls it, and the title of the book comes from when she was a kid, her brother, I think it was, had to do a report on birds. And he was just pulling his hair out. You know how it is when you're a kid and you're just like
Right.
paralyzed, like you can't, just something seems absolutely overwhelming. And her father just like patted him on the shoulder and said, just take it bird by bird, buddy, like one bird at a time,
Right.
And yeah, like that's and that kind of, Tortoise in a way is kind of built around that ethos too. Like you just take things one step at a time and kind of chop the problem into manageable bits. And with the writing too, like, do a little bit at a time, get it down there, and you can always edit it later. You're not performing live in front of an audience. Like you're
Right.
not, you can get editing, you can find out what works and what doesn't, and, see whether or not that criticism like really resonates. So yeah, there's a lot of freedom when you embrace that process and just kind of take it a step at a time. So.
That reminds me, maybe you'll appreciate this, but this is like the as I like to call it, the Gandalf principle, like arriving when precisely when you mean to, and just not rushing things. Yeah. So that's
okay.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And then there's something you brought up here. I forgot what I was going to ask. Okay. It's all good. Yeah. Oh, no, that's what I was going to ask. So with respect to, you talk about doing research, right? You talk about want to make sure you know your stuff. Is there, have you ever dealt with an issue or like, how do you deal with having too much or too little research versus too much research, and just kind of trying to find that balancing act? Like, how do you know where to find that middle ground?
There's a quote from a friend of mine, I think, who got it from a professor of his, that an author, Martin C., really a talented local author. And it's basically like when you're stuck, do research. And when you're not stuck, stop doing research, So like a lot of times it is, and that was something I learned in journalism school too. Like you can put like the letters TK stand for to come, like you can put a little placeholder in a story to signify like, okay, I've got to go back and, find this detail. I've got to go back and, fill in this response from this person. And maybe they don't give you a response and you have to put in like, they weren't available. But yeah, in fiction, you can do that too. You can say like, okay, I'm going to write this, and I'm going to get to this point, and then, I need to figure this out. So I need to circle back and, and sometimes that can really shape your work. Like Island of Clouds, like my previous one to Infinite Blues, like I was waiting to hear back on the technical stuff for the main mission. So I started writing like some of the historical scenes that these characters would have lived through, that I did have the research already to be able to write. And so I would write those, and then the technical information would come in, and then I'd be able to work on that. And so you can kind of work on a scene at a time and like do what you're able to do in the moment, and then rearrange it after the fact. And so that book I did end up writing out of sequence, but with a kind of idea of what the structure, and it's weird, like sometimes putting pen to paper just magically like starts to crystallize the structure. Like Infinite Blues, like some of the end scenes were the ones that I thought of first. And then I started writing them, and and sometimes it would be just a sentence or a phrase that I wanted to get down. But there is something magical about getting your butt in the seat and getting something down, and then that would get the juices flowing to be like, okay, like this is how this is going to be structured. And that you start thinking about, it's funny and pathetic in a way. I've heard writers described as like, people who are solving problems for like imaginary problems for characters in their head or whatever. But
Right.
but it is funny. Like you start working on it and you start coming up with problems and solving problems and coming up with other problems and solving them. And yeah, it's a messy process that can result in something that's very, clean and precise at the end. So
Interesting. It's funny hearing you talk about problem solving, because one of the things I kind of pride myself as an old grad. So for those not familiar, at West Point we have the Thayer method of teaching, which you teach yourself before you go to class, and that's there's a lot of cynicism that's tied to that, where it's like, why the hell am I doing this? I'm going to a really good school. You should be teaching me how to these lessons. You should be teaching me physics, chemistry, or whatever. This is ridiculous and absurd. You feel like betrayed in certain ways. But as I became more mature, and especially when I got out of the military, I just sort of felt like, okay, the reason why they taught us that was just to enable us to be problem solvers, to try to get ahead of the problem, more or less. Do you feel like that's the Thayer method has been really helpful for you, moving forward as a creative writer?
It's certainly the notion of responsibility and accountability, and figure out what you can on your own, and then and that does actually kind of tie in with what I was talking about professionalism and coming to people with the questions that only they can answer. Because that's another thing about the Thayer method, was like, you do the reading the day before, and if it's a physics issue or whatever, like I had to do a nuclear engineering track, you're going to get stuck at some point. But the professor at the beginning of class gives you a chance to say, like, all right, like, who has questions about what we read? And if there was something that you're legitimately stuck at, you could say, like, look, sir, I don't know how to, model this thermal neutron flux or whatever it was.
I have no idea what you just said.
It was a little more fun because it was just more like, okay, everybody's read the reading and we can have kind of a freewheeling discussion. But yeah, no, it does kind of tie in that respect pretty well, I think. So that's
pretty. And almost another question I had was, because you talk about with end scenes in mind, that you wrote the Infinite Blues, which I think I thought about this quite often as a creative person with writing stuff as well, where you want to know what the end state is for the story, because obviously, like, it's the climax, it's the most interesting part of the story. It's when the lessons are learned more or less and put into play. And then is that how you've always written? Is that, because I feel like that's what's interesting, is that it's almost like backwards planning in a lot of ways, which I think is really useful as a writing tool.
It is. It's weird. I think I'm drawn to historical and space stuff in part because there is a ready-made structure to it. There is a really, and with a space mission, it's like you've got a mission. It's pretty clear, like, that you've got a structure of some part, although you can kind of depart from that creatively and narratively. But yeah, I think I can't think of a lot of things where I've had no structure going in. Like, I know authors and people who are a little more freewheeling in terms of, and granted, you still do discover a lot in the process. Like, you start to discover, like, okay, I need this scene and I need this scene and I need to, but it's been a certain amount of back and forth. Like, one of the examples that really comes to mind is in Resistance, my novel about the Heydrich assassination. I read a manuscript of a Czech spy master who was talking about this prisoner exchange in a train station. And when I was writing that, like I said, I was writing it as screenplays.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, okay, like, I knew I wanted to use this scene, but I was like, okay, like, well, what do you do when you're in a train station and you're waiting? Like, you wander around and you like look at the schedules and stuff. Like you don't, like you're killing time. And so then that kind of helped crystallize the scene and helped build the scene. I heard somewhere that like the most important trait an author can have is empathy. So when you start putting yourself in your characters' heads and like, okay, what did they see? What did they know? What did the world look like to them? Things start to make a little bit more sense. I'm going to pull a book off the shelf, which has really been important to me. And I feel bad plugging this book because it's kind
no,
of
it's fine.
Navy. Herman Wouk, The Cane Mutiny. But he talks about like there's a lot that's really brilliant in there about the military, but he also talks about people like recreating their successes and avoiding their failures.
Right.
And I really realized like that's a huge like driving factor for everybody. Is like people try to kind of recreate their biggest success and avoid their biggest failure. And so when you go back in time, you think, okay, like if I don't know about Hitler and the Holocaust and all that stuff that I, as a late 20th century, early 21st century person know, what did 1936 or 1938 look like to somebody? Well, they were paralyzed by what had happened in World War I. They had this huge, horrible thing happen to them that they wanted to avoid at any cost, and in the case of the Czechs, for instance, they had also had this really great triumph, in the fact that they won their independence during World War I. So it's like, how are people trying to respond to their past, not to my past, but to their past?
Right.
With Infinite Blues, one of the characters, Robert Lawrence, would have been the nation's first Black astronaut. Actually got in touch with his son, Tracy Lawrence, here in Chicago, and I got in touch with, really weird random story. I got in touch with a guy who went to high school with him, and you realize like, okay, for me, living after the drug wars and whatnot, a certain part of, Chicago just seems like a wasteland in my mind, like,
right.
but I'm seeing the consequences of the drug wars. And in the 50s, that same neighborhood was a lively, bustling place. It was a place where people went to work in the steel mills, and, people went to work in the stockyards and whatnot. And so, getting rid of the lenses through which I'm viewing history and seeing what history, seeing what it looked like before it was history. It's a lot of work, but it's really fascinating and really, really fun. So
that's really good because I'm really enjoying a lot of the things you're saying, because I agree with a lot of the things that you are basically advocating for, where there's like multiple different lenses to look at a situation, especially across time. And I really appreciate the talking points about World War I, because I learned probably the most about World War I while at the academy as well. And one of my biggest talking points is like after World War I, like Francis totally took advantage of the Treaty of Versailles and took for example, Alsace-Lorraine away from Germany, which had nothing to do with World War I at all, which is interesting. But like for people not familiar with, like, Otto von Bismarck had basically had he annexed Alsace-Lorraine, in France. Prior to, like late, 19th century, basically. I'm totally nerding out right now. Really my nerdy side. But anyways, but a lot of that stuff, people try to, look at the world from a very simplistic perspective, and it's really not that simple. I tell people we live in a multivariable calculus world, and there are so many variables that come into play that you probably don't even realize at this moment. And yeah, so
and I should add, like, none of this to say is, I mean Hitler was as bad as they come. Like Heydrich was as bad as they come, and these were all very bad people, but in their heads they were the good guys.
Exactly.
You know, in their heads they were good fighting evil. You know, that doesn't mean we need to buy into their worldview or give them a platform, but it does mean we need the empathy to understand why they thought they were doing the right thing. Like Hitler, you know, Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I was like, well, we're gonna institute a new map of Europe based on self-determination, and people get to decide, you know, what country they belong to. And so they're breaking up Austria-Hungary along those lines. So, okay, now the Czechs and Slovaks have a nation, the Hungarians have a nation. Like, all this sounds very good.
The Lithuanians,
but when you have a person like Hitler who's acting in bad faith, he will take those arguments and say, like, look, all I want is self-determination for the Germans. You know, all I want is self-determination for these Germans in Alsace-Lorraine to be a part of Germany, or for these Germans in the Sudetenland to be a part of Germany, rather than, you know. And so, yeah, it's just really, it's just fascinating to strip away the lenses that you're using to look at history, and again, just put yourself in their heads and say, like, okay, what did this look like to them?
Exactly.
You know, what did the Munich Agreement to Neville Chamberlain look like? He was saving Europe from another destructive war.
Exactly.
You know, and we know that it wasn't. It's hard to see it in any other way. You know?
Yep. Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay. And, this has all been really interesting. One more question, and then we'll go on our fun moment. So, what kind of advice? What kind of advice can you give someone who's looking to transition in a creative career? Because it's if based upon something you told me, and feel free to clarify this as well. Because are you creative full time? Are you getting there? Like, what are you doing to get from point A to point B? And what kind of advice can you impart to those people who want to do that, especially transitioning out of the military?
My best advice is to do what's important to you as early in the day as possible. I write before I go to work. I work on tourist stuff before I go to my full-time job. Just do what's important early in the day. So then you're done with it. Then you don't have to wonder, like, when am I going to get to my writing today? When am I going to get to this? And then you don't have to shortchange your family either. Like, it's still tough to kind of come up with that balance, again, like right now I had to kind of shoo my family out so I could do this podcast. But like
same with me, by the way. Same with me, by the way. So yeah,
do that stuff early, and find the joy in it. Like, joy is a really important word for me, because that's the happiness that comes from God. Find the joy in it and do it for its own sake. Like, if you're obsessing about when am I going to get this level of acclaim, like, there's going to be a point where you get whatever you think is going to make you happy, and then there's going to point after that where you're just you again. Like, I've had some nice successes with Tortoise, like Rick Cogan, who's like a really big, like, Chicago media guy. Like, he's the guy who wrote Roger Ebert's obituary for the Chicago Tribune. Like, that's how.
Oh, wow.
Chicago media. Like, he called us one of the most exciting and innovative and provocative, like, small presses in the country. And like,
that's cool.
It was really fantastic. It's really nice to get that. But, we got that by focusing on just focusing on the work itself, focusing on the quality, and just kind of leaving the results in God's hands, basically, you know, and just trusting that, you know, if I work on the stuff that's in my control, the stuff that's outside of my control is going to work out eventually. And it may be to my benefit that it doesn't work out on my time frame. Like Resistance, like I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be this big, huge thing. It's going to take off. It's going to sell like, you know, 50 kajillion copies or whatever. I had to estimate for my licensing for the front cover photo. I had to estimate how many copies it was going to sell, and I estimated like 25,000 copies. And I'm like, oh my God, if I could sell 25,000 copies, that would be insane. Because like all of Tortoise together is like almost at 15,000 copies yet, all of our titles, you know. And you know, so, you know, I was convinced Resistance was going to be my ticket to the big time, and it wasn't. But I've had so much fun working on the space books, you know, working without deadline pressure on them. I've got a little bit of deadline pressure now on the last one. Now that I've got a distributor, I've kind of committed to a time slot for that. But I'm grateful now that things didn't work out the way I thought they would then. So whatever happens to you, be grateful for it and put it to good use. Like that was a really great leadership quote that I saw. I think it was after the Academy, but it really resonated with me with a lot of what I'd seen. This guy said, the most pathetic trait in a leader is self-pity.
Yes.
Like, and it's so easy to fall into the self-pity trap. Like, oh, my book hasn't sold enough copies yet. I'm not like doing this full time. Blah, blah, blah. And I've heard elsewhere, like the opposite of self-pity is gratitude. So like, be grateful. Like I'm grateful I had a chance to work on Resistance. I'm grateful I launched it with a Kickstarter because I was able to raise $6,800 and license a bunch of historical photos for it and put together the book that was in my head that I probably wouldn't have gotten the chance to do that with a big publishing house because they would have had different constraints. And I had the ability to write the space books the way I wanted to. Now, having said that, I'm ready to hit the big time, you know. But you know, but in the meantime, I'm trying to be grateful for where I'm at and enjoy it. And most of the days I'm there. So
no, there's a lot that I can relate to. Unfortunately, I have so many more questions to add on top of you know what you just said. No, because there's a lot of things. Because it kind of like with me, things didn't quite pan out as I had hoped they would. I have a normal, you know, typical day job as well. You know, I have a sales job by day, and I do the creative stuff wherever I can, like this on the weekends and my free time, wherever I can spare it. Obviously, you know, budgeting my time with my family and just taking those calculated times or risks or sacrifices, if you will. You know, choosing I can sacrifice a little bit of time here away from my family. It won't be too disruptive or it won't have a negative impact or that much of a negative impact. You don't know these things until later on, of course. But this is life. So all right, so Jerry, what I want to do here is we're gonna play a game. Actually, we didn't do this on the last one. So you're a really big Martin Scorsese fan, I saw. Yeah. So what I did was everyone knows Martin Scorsese as the director, but do you know him as Martin Scorsese, the actor? So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna see if you can identify, you know, each of these films that Martin Scorsese, you know, these screenshots are. So this first one, like, what movie is this?
I'm gonna say Hugo.
It is Hugo. That's correct. Yep,
right.
Hugo.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know he did Hugo.
Okay, this next one.
Okay, that's Color of Money, right?
Yes, that is also the Color of Money. These get a little bit harder, by the way. Okay. All right. Okay, that's Martin Scorsese with a spotlight right there.
Oh, I'm gonna guess King of Comedy.
No, it's actually After Hours.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. What movie is this?
Oh my gosh. I'm really stumped.
Okay. This is actually King of Comedy.
Oh, okay. Man,
Yeah.
yeah, I threw myself off.
Here we go.
Oh, that's I know he's in that movie. Is that Dory Finding
No.
Nemo?
It is not. This is actually you want to take one more stab, or you want the answer?
I remember seeing his credits on the Fish movie, and I was like,
can we appreciate the eyebrows for a brief moment here? The eyebrows. the spit.
That's yeah, that's a good fish detail.
So this is Shark Tale with with Will Smith. Yeah. So it was a DreamWorks Animation. DreamWorks Animation didn't do quite so well, not as successful as, for example, Pixar. So all right, this one might be a little bit tougher.
I don't know.
This one's actually a quiz show.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
Okay, and this last one, this is gonna reveal how nerdy you are with Martin Scorsese. Okay, all right.
Oh my gosh, it looks like Van Gogh.
It is Van Gogh.
I'm trying to think of what movie that would be. I don't know.
This is so off the beaten path, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
This is Dreams, which was a collab with Akira Kurosawa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So
yeah.
So
cool.
pretty tough. A lot of people don't appreciate Scorsese as the actor. So I mean, you got quite a few of those though. That was pretty good.
I thought you were going to hit me with one of the easy ones like him in Taxi Driver or something like that. But,
I found a couple of those. I was like, okay, but I want to make this interesting, So
yeah.
Jerry, this has been a really fun conversation.
Andy,
I really appreciate the time you gave me for this. And so, do you have any, social media plugs, your website, email address, contact? How can people find you?
Yeah, come to tortoisebooks.com. There's lots of books for sale on there. There's probably gonna be something that strikes your fancy. I'm on Twitter reasonably often as I think it's at Jerry with a J. I think it's _Brennan. And then Tortoise Books on Twitter. There are a lot too. So yeah.
Excellent. I'll go ahead and drop it in the description for the video as well as the audio recording. But Jerry, this has been great. I definitely I would love to talk to you again, to be in all seriousness, because I had even more conversation. I had a lot of questions I didn't even want to I couldn't even get to. We're having such a really good. No, it was good. It was a very involved conversation, which is what I always try to strive for. And it's been great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
All right.
Yeah.
You have a wonderful day.
All right. Take care. You too.
Yep.